Hi, I'm Brenda Cockerham with the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. I'm a family consumer sciences agent, and I thought today that we would talk about food preservation. So there's a lot of choices with food preservation that you may want to consider, and these choices are something for you to think about. So that being said, extension offices around the state have free publications on freezing, drying, canning, and harvesting all manner of food. It could be wild game, it could be soups, it could be kraut, it could be whatever topic you want. We probably have a good sample on file for you to have free of charge. So if you're not in this county in Kentucky, which is Johnson County, you may be throughout the state, and all extension offices have access to this. In fact, they have a website that you can also pull these publications from free of charge, but you will have access to a professional who can help guide you through some decisions. Let's start with talking about the acidity of foods. So when you can high acid foods, you don't have to worry much about some of the things that you have to think about with low acid foods, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But high acid foods are going to be things like tomatoes, tomato products, salsa, pickles, fruits, and we'll visit this again. But basically, that's the kinds of things that would be high acid foods. The easiest way to determine the acidity level of a food is knowing the rule of thumb, which is that most fruits are high in acid. However, some things like cantaloupes and figs and raisins will be low acid. So that's where it pays to be using a source of information, of research-based information, to help guide you through your preservation efforts, because those recipes are tested in the USDA labs, and they know the acidity level of foods, and therefore their guidance and their recipes are based on that accordingly. If it's a vegetable, you can know it's going to be low acid. So again, using those research approved recipes are so valuable because you don't have to know those details. You simply just follow the recipe. A couple of resources that are good are Blue Book, Food Preservation. They have put a lot of energy into researching that. So Easy to Preserve from the University of Georgia, they also have put some time and energy into this, and so they have a neat cookbook available with a lot of varieties of recipes. And of course, again, the USDA and all the cooperative extension services have those basic recipes that are also available free of charge. This is what our publications look like. And again, they start with the beginning, the home canning basics and drying, and whatever the topic is, there's going to be a publication available. Let's start with freezing foods. Freezing is an excellent way to preserve food. It's quick, it's easy, it leaves the food, when it's done properly, it leaves the food really fresh tasting when you have to use it again, although it does change the texture. So as you're thinking through that, you have to figure out, what are you going to use this food for? Is it going to be a soup? Is it going to be what is your favorite recipe, and how are you going to be using that? So that's part of the thinking process you need to go through. The acidity level is not going to matter with freezing. Both fruits and vegetables can be frozen, and again, it may affect the texture and the process and the way you do it. We'll talk about that in a minute, about how to keep it as safe and fresh as you possibly can. There are a few tricks to the trade, and we'll share that with you. For example, corn. Corn is one of my favorite things to freeze. But if you want corn to last a long time in the freezer, then there's some steps. Once it's picked, and of course, anytime you preserve a food, you don't want to preserve a bad food. It's not going to make it any better when you put it in the freezer. So you want your the food that you preserve to be fresh, freshly picked, some of the best there is, because when you pull it back out, it will also reflect that quality. So pick the best. When you shuck the corn, you're going to do what we call blanching. This pot of water is a boiling pot, and you don't really cook the food. You simply dip it into it and let it cook for just a second. And that's referred to as blanching, not really cooking. Immediately after that, you stick it over into the ice water to stop that process, because what you're doing is you're killing enzymes, and those enzymes are the messengers to tell that food to continue the deterioration process, and you don't want that, so you kill them, and then that helps preserve the food. Now, if you eat your food, a lot of people like to skip the blanching step, and when you do, the first month or two, you probably won't notice a difference. So if it's a short-term freezing process, you may not have to bother with this, but if you think that that's going to be in there 3, 4, 5, 6 months, that's when it really starts to show. The blanching step will help preserve that food and maintain the quality longer. So once you've done that, you can cut it, sauce it, put it in the container that you want to put it in, and then go from there. Some of the packages that are available now are really very helpful in pulling that air out of the package, because that is one of the tricks of keeping a good quality food that is frozen, is pulling that air out, because it's the frost. You don't want frostbite on it. You don't want any air to begin tainting the surface, so to speak, because those crystals will begin changing the flavor. So some of the products that are out there that will extract the air from the product and leave it with a nice vacuum seal, that can be nice in the effort of removing the air and maintaining quality. Our publication will look like this and give you all the guides that you need to know about freezing. Drying foods is another option. And with drying, again, you don't have to worry about the acidity level. In drying, your concern is the moisture content, because when you pull out the moisture content, that is the way it is robbing any bacteria of the ability to grow. Bacteria is kind of like you and I. It needs a source of food, it needs a source of water, and it has to have the right temperature. So when you remove any one of these, this is the first step in preserving food. So in this case, we're withdrawing the moisture, and that is what preserves the food and prevents the bacteria from growing. So this is one of the oldest methods ever, and you see people do all kinds of things. They'll string beans and hang them up to dry. I've seen people put cheesecloth over the food and on a screen, and as long as there's airflow up and down and throughout it, and yet it's protected from bugs and things, then in a dry area, I've seen attics and cars and all kinds of things used. So you can do drying very inexpensively and very effectively. However, the dehydrator is way far the coolest and quickest, most effective method of food preservation when it comes to drying. So there's all kinds of varieties, all kinds of standards. There's even something called a freeze dryer, which is super quick and crispy and just a really good quality food, but they're extremely expensive. So a plain old drying process is nice. And if the electric goes out in the winter, you don't have to worry about, like a frozen product, like it going bad. Drying, you're good to go. So that is always a nice consideration. But once again, you have to think through, what is the end product going to be? What is this food going to be used for, and the recipe it's going to be used for, because that will help you determine which method to use. So here we go. Acidity is not an issue. It's a nice safety measure in the winter, and it's very affordable. You can do it with pretty much nothing. This is our publication on drying, and of course you can dry them outdoors, sun drying, on and on. So it's a great method. Canning high acid foods, again, it's a little quicker and easier. We referred to this earlier: tomatoes, tomato products, salsa, pickles, fruits. These are all classified as high acid foods. The pickles are made from cucumbers, which are vegetables, but that salt and vinegar used in pickles will raise the acidity, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. So the high acid foods are pretty easy to preserve. The fruits, jams, jellies, pickles, kraut, all those are, they're easier because you only need to hot bath them. And we'll talk about that, what that means. But what you also have to do is look for that acidity level. So even though that food may be classified as high acid, sometimes you got to make sure it's high acid. And the way you do that is you use either 5% vinegar or lemon juice. And lemon juice is, I think, a little bit more acidic than vinegar. So sometimes you use less of a quantity on the lemon juice. If you don't like those ingredients in your recipe, you can pressure can, and then you don't have to worry about that. So that's an option to be aware of. Again, the pickles and the kraut are an example of taking a low acid food and turning it into a high acid food through the acidity created by fermentation. Now that's just using salt. You can also bring vinegar to the table, and that vinegar will raise the acidity as well. Just depends on the recipe you use. This is a kind of a new thing that's, I think, fairly recent. The cucumbers in this apparatus is in a jar, and there's a spring in it. And if you'll notice this little thing at the top, in the traditional fermentation process, salt is used and age, and the two together take foods and allow them to ferment. And when they ferment, those gases have to escape, and that's what this little valve is for. The spring is to keep it the product held underwater. So here is what's happened in the case of fermentation. You see the spring holding the basically pickles at this time down low beneath the earth, or the water rather, and the yucky stuff is referred to as scum, and it's not exactly mold, although mold can be a part of it, and there's good mold or mold that you can tolerate and mold that you can't tolerate, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But this scum is scooped off and removed, and that leaves your product fermented and ready to consume. Now that can stay in the refrigerator for about 6 months, but you can also process it, and when you process it, it has a shelf life. You can then keep it just on the shelf. So this is what we're talking about when we say a hot water bath. This is a hot water bath canners, and each of them, if you'll notice, they're very tall. They allow for your jars. If you have a quart size or a pint, either one, they're going to fit in this space. And you have to have at least an inch above that container. So when it's boiling, that it gets a nice full coverage of heat, and that lid receives that heat, and that space of the airspace above the product and under the lid also gets exposed to heat adequately. So this is what you need for high acid foods. The publications we have, as you can see, are numerous. The salsas, tomatoes, jams and jellies and pickles, and just basics about home canning. All those things are available at your extension office. This is something I wanted to share about tomatoes and some of the tools that you can work with to make the job quicker and easier. Once you, if you've ever peeled a tomato, you know that's a bit of an issue. So if you have a pot of hot water, you just put the tomatoes in and it just makes those peelings kind of pop off. And that's what you see right here. So you don't boil them to cook them. You're just putting them in boiling water briefly, pulling them out and just to get the peeling off of them, which is one way of doing that. Another way is with this apparatus. Sometimes they're on mixers, sometimes they're standalone juicers. This particular one, you put the tomato, and these tomatoes have not been peeled, they've not been cored. The same would be true if you were processing apples or anything else. You don't have to do any of those steps. You simply put the product in this apparatus, and it uses the gears of the, in this case, mixer, to grind. And this part of the apparatus extracts the peeling, the core, the seeds, anything that you don't want. It extracts it, and it comes out this little hole right here and shoots it out the end. And then your product that you're saving, the actual pulp or the juice, is going to be directed another way, and your job's done for you, which is so cool. I mean, it really reduces the time and energy on this, probably down to 10% of what you would do normally. So these are a nice addition to your kitchen. You can go old school and just chop things up by hand. That's fine. If you want them nice and big and chunky, you're probably going to have to do that, because if you use some of the grinders and all that, you sometimes chop them up really tiny, and it just depends on what you want. Either are okay. It's just up to you. You're going to want to start with hot jars if your substance is hot. So you'll learn about something called hot pack and cold pack. And hot pack simply means that you're taking the product, heating it first, and putting it into a hot jar. And then the processing, therefore, is reduced just a little because it's already hot. The other perk of using that method is sometimes the solids and the liquids will separate a little bit. And if you want more solid than you do liquid, you can scoop up the solid part and put that in your canning jar and leave the liquid behind, maybe even canning it separately sometimes. But that gives you some choice. If you use cold pack, they're going to separate in the jar. So cold pack actually begins cooking inside the jar, and it's in the jar a little bit longer. So those are some of the decisions you just need to make based on the end product you want. You're going to be looking at some headspace. They're going to tell you, oh, it should be a 1/2 inch, 1/4 of an inch, 1 inch from the top of the jar. They're going to ask you to clean the top of the jar. And the reason they're doing that is just to prevent any food particles from blocking the adherence of that tiny little rim of rubber that's at the top of that melts just a little bit to create that seal, because you have to have a good seal to have a shelf, to increase your shelf life for your products. Another thing to think of is the salt that you use. You want a canning salt that is non-caking and has no additives. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. But the other thing is these things can often have the acidity ingredient, such as vinegar or lemon juice, added to each jar to ensure that each jar has the adequate amount. So the canning salt does not have any of the anti-caking agents. And it's those agents that cause cloudiness. So you can't use table salt. I mean, use it, but if you do, you're probably going to get cloudiness. You're going to get some effects that you probably don't really want in your product. So this is why getting a canning and pickling salt is important when you're doing your recipes. The jams and jellies, they're fun and easy to do. The thing that that helps most on them is the hot water bath. A lot of people like to pour their hot ingredient into their jar, slip on the lid. The heat of the product actually warms that lid, the rubber part of that lid, or whatever substance that is, and it will create a seal. And they think, oh, well, that's good. We've done our job. But what hasn't occurred is this airspace in between the lid and the product has not been sterilized. So if you were to put this into a hot water bath and you boil it, you got about an inch of water over the top of this jar, and it boils, then it will actually kill the mold spores that's caught in this airspace. And that in basically will extend the life of your product and decrease the odds of having any kind of mold growth or anything happening in there. So the kind of bacteria, it's not so much the bacteria, it's more the mold with these high acid products that you're concerned about, because you don't want mold in there. I know years ago that they would put wax on the surface of them, and then they'd just scoop it off and they'd see a little mold, and they'd scoop that off and life is good. But in reality, those mold spores, and especially if they're allowed to grow, they have really deep roots. And so that can actually infiltrate your product. And when people eat it, they can get sick from that, especially if they're sensitive to mold. So to create a safe product, you're going to want a hot water bath them. Cabbage comes in often in a bumper crop. This is the cabbage we had this year, and almost every head was anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds per head. Huge heads of cabbage. So when you get crops like that and you've shared it with everyone, you use it in all your recipes, and cabbage lasts a good while in the refrigerator, but you still got to do something with it. So we chose to do kraut, and there's a trick to kraut. There's many different ways you can prepare kraut, but fermentation is an old-fashioned tradition, and it's a little bit eerie for people who are just starting fermentation. You sometimes see mold and all. That's kind of scary, I guess. And sometimes it should be scary, and sometimes it isn't. So we'll talk about that. The old-fashioned crocks are a favorite to make the krauts in, because they have a lot of space. But when you cut up cabbage, there's a lot of air in there, and there's a lot of water in the cabbage itself. So this is probably a head of cabbage cut up, and it's a huge space. So how do you get, 25 pounds of cabbage in this space when, one huge head seems to take up that space? So there's a little bit of a trick to it. And it's layering, and your recipe should call for ever so many pounds, so much salt, and you have to pay attention to that. You have to get the right ratio. So you might want some scales to help you. In fact, you do want some scales to help you stay on top of the right ratios of salt per product, because it's hard to see. When you look at it, you can't tell if it's all fluffy. You can't tell how much weight that is. So you have to measure it. So once you measure it and you have the layer of the layer of cabbage, and then the layer, a little bit of salt, whatever they told you in your recipe, then you have to kind of mash it down. You mash it and work it in. You work the salt in, you work the airspace out of the kraut, and you keep layering that. And after you keep layering it, two things happen. Your space decreases, your airspace decreases, and then the salt begins pulling the moisture out of the kraut, or out of the cabbage rather. And so you layer after layer, you put that in there, and you until you fill your vat. Now you need this kind of surface. You don't want metals. You don't want the salt interacting with the metals, because you have to keep them in there for like a month or longer. And that's a long time for salt to be next to any other product or anything besides kind of a glass-like surface. So this is the inside of a slow cooker, and that is a nice crock that most people would be likely to have. It doesn't make a lot, but it is a nice surface to work with. The other thing is, once you get all of this packed in, then you've got to seal it off. Some people use plates, but plates have the airspace around the edge. Others like to use food grade bags filled with salt water, and sometimes they double bag them. And that seals off the edges very nicely, but you can see right here where that little tiny edge allowed a little bit of, this might be scum or it might be mold, I don't know, but that we have to scoop that off and get rid of it. So there's a little, if you see white, gray, or green mold, then that's acceptable. Scoop it off, discard it, and move on. But if you see orange, black, whatever, you've got to discard your whole product, because those are dangerous kinds of molds. And if you'll see over here, that's how they look, quite nasty. They gotta go. Can't salvage that. So it's a bit of an art. You have to be patient with it, but it's also kind of fun. And they're very popular for probiotic characteristics, I guess. Again, 4, 5, 6 weeks that it takes to wait. Now, there are other recipes that are quicker, and you use vinegar, and you can use different methods, but to ferment naturally also raises the acidity. So this is an age-old method of preserving food. If you want that to be preserved for months to come outside of the refrigerator, then you have to then hot water bath it. So you know about that. Now we're coming to low acid foods. So low acid foods are always vegetables, the green beans, and of course any vegetable, and soups and stews and even meats. All of those are classified as low acid. There's only one way to preserve these foods in a can, and that is with this apparatus. You have to have a pressure canner to do this safely. The reason is this canner can bring the temperature of foods to above boiling. The pressure allows it to come above boiling. And the reason that is important is some bacteria grows with a low acid food, no oxygen environment, room temperature. They thrive in that, and you can't kill them by boiling. The spores of that creates the botulism bacteria, you can't boil it. You can boil it all day long and it won't kill it. And that's why you have to have this apparatus in order to preserve those foods safely. Botulinum spore is just tough, and it's, the bacteria can be killed by boiling, but not the spore. And the spore is sort of like the seed, and the seed that grows into botulism. And so if it gets caught in that airspace and it's allowed to grow, it's just a very dangerous and deadly bacteria. And that's why we don't take chances with that. But to learn more about how to preserve those soup stocks and stews and wild game and fish, and they're all possible. You simply just follow the rules that have been researched, and it'll keep your family safe and your products safe, and you can feel confident about sharing them with others. So if there are any questions that you have, you're welcome to call the Johnson County Extension Office. Our number is 606-789-8108, but there are extension offices in every county in Kentucky, and you're welcome to call them. We also have a website. The website at the University of Kentucky is found through Cooperative Extension Service. So that is where you would seek the information in the publications, along with many, many other things that are available for you to use. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We appreciate your listening, and good luck with your canning.